Religion and politics are two complex topics that are often divisive. In the current United States political climate, there has been an alarming trend of accusing Christians as being extremists. However, anyone that truly understands the principles of Christianity knows that this is far from accurate.
Christians can be found across the entire political spectrum, and it is well understood that mixing religion and politics is a false equivalency. However, there are several recent cultural topics that have put Christians in a difficult position due to societal pressure to comply with views contrary to the teachings of the Bible. And as Christians, we often find ourselves having to navigate through these challenges to ensure our actions and beliefs align with God's expectations. Although there certainly are Christians on all sides of the political spectrum, a 2017 Pew survey revealed a 44% majority of liberal Democrats believe churches and religious organizations have a more negative impact on the country, whereas only 40% viewed them as having a positive impact. On the other side of the spectrum, an overwhelming 75% majority of conservative Republicans believe churches and religious organizations have a positive impact. You might ask why this is the case, especially if you consider yourself to be a liberal Christian. The primary purpose of this video will be to attempt to answer this question. One thing to mention beforehand is that the majority of us have already heard many times from prominent figures in the media about how unfathomable it is that Christians could support certain conservative actions, such as voting for Donald Trump or being strongly opposed to open borders. In fact, Leviticus 19 verses 33 through 34 specifically says, "The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt." But in the current polarizing nature of politics, everything is usually only presented as being black or white, when the reality is there are always gray areas that many fail to acknowledge, which are vital for understanding perspective. As an example, some liberal Democrats would likely find it hard to believe that a majority of Christians support immigration. The only caveat is many of these Christians simply believe there needs to be negotiation on an adequate vetting process to ensure immigrants are not coming in to conduct nefarious acts and intend to have a positive contribution to the country. The purpose for pointing this out is, as Christians, our political choices should not be driven simply on beliefs of a specific party, but rather beliefs that are most in line with God's teachings and principles. However, this is not easy to accomplish, as there are always these gray areas that Christians must navigate through when deciding on a side to align with politically. This gets us to the question for why more Christians choose to lean conservative versus liberal. I will say that there are currently some ridiculous reasons for this being promoted by the liberal media, but this is far from the truth. The truth is, conservative values more often align with traditional Christian teachings, such as traditional marriage between a man and a woman and the sanctity of life. Additionally, conservative political ideologies often promote personal responsibility, self-reliance, and a limited role for government. One example of this that receives no shortage of heated debate is the act of abortion. Essentially, all of us know the "my body, my choice" argument for abortion, along with the liberal belief that life does not start until the baby exits the womb. However, most conservatives believe life starts at the point of conception and view abortion as an act of murder. So where should Christians stand on this issue? Well, although the Bible does not explicitly mention the act of abortion, there are passages that address the value of human life and the sanctity of life, which most Christians interpret as being against abortion. One example is from Exodus 21 verses 22 through 25, which says, "If men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life." So although the Bible does not specifically mention the word abortion, these verses support the argument that human life begins at conception and that taking the life of an unborn child is morally wrong. And given the fact that most liberal Democrats are so passionately in favor of abortion and see no moral issue with the act, leads most Christians to side with conservatives on the issue of abortion. Another factor that may lead more Christians to identify as conservative politically is their belief in the importance of individual liberty and freedom. Conservative political ideologies often promote policies that support individual liberty, such as limited government and free market policies. Many Christians see this as aligning with the belief that each person is responsible for their own salvation, and that the government should not interfere with their religious beliefs. As an example, during the peak of the COVID pandemic in 2020, many Democrats supported the shutdown of churches by health officials, but simultaneously remained silent when those same health officials decided to keep marijuana and liquor stores open. And it is no surprise that such hypocrisy would lead a Christian towards the conservative side of the spectrum in this case.
Another example is in respect to the current transgender movement. While Democrats often advocate for equality and tolerance of other views, critics argue that they tend to silence and censor individuals who hold differing views on topics such as transgender ideology. Critics also point to support for allowing men identifying as women to compete in women's sports as a violation of women's rights. Finally, their tolerance on this matter, such as support for gender reassignment surgery and therapy for minors, is seen by many Christians as a violation of God's design for human sexuality. This brings us to one final point, which is the topic of deliberate dishonesty. Now, it would be misleading to assume that deliberate dishonesty only exists on the left side of the political spectrum, but it is the frequency, nature, and motivation of the dishonesty that is key. One example of this dishonesty was again during the COVID pandemic, when Democrats supported the statement from health officials that labeled Christian groups protesting the closure of churches as a public health risk, while simultaneously saying large groups across the country protesting in response to the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were no risk to public health. There is no way to describe this other than being deliberately dishonest for the sole purpose of promoting hate and division, which ended up being further reflected through the vast number of deadly and destructive riots that ensued across America as a result of the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Speaking of which, the contrast between the Democratic Party's reaction to these events versus the January 6th events at the United States Capitol serves as an example of their blatant hypocrisy and inconsistency. Critics argue that while the party continues to condemn and highlight the actions of those involved in the breach of the Capitol, they have been less vocal in addressing and even supportive of violence and rioting that occurred in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Some contend that this disparity in reaction demonstrates a double standard in the party's response to acts of unrest, calling into question their actual motives and commitment to law and order. Regarding the silencing of individuals, censorship has also been a major topic of recent concern, with critics alleging that the Democratic Party has used its influence to suppress conservative voices in various media platforms. Accusations of labeling conservative speech as hate speech have raised concerns about the party's intentions to control the narrative and stifle dissenting opinions. Also, another example of this censorship is related to the Hunter Biden laptop story suppressed by all social media outlets and labeled as Russian disinformation prior to the 2020 election, when in fact, anyone that researched the authenticity of the story at the time knew it was true. It is worth noting another instance of deception and perceived hypocrisy within the Democratic Party's treatment of sexual harassment allegations. During the confirmation process of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Democrats vehemently opposed his nomination, raising allegations of sexual misconduct without substantial evidence. The party's reaction showcased a strong willingness to condemn and tarnish an individual's reputation based on an accusation alone. However, in the case of Tara Reade's sexual harassment allegations against Joe Biden, the Democratic Party's response appeared to be markedly different. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, some critics argue that the party and its supporters largely ignored or downplayed Reade's claims. These differing reactions regarding sexual harassment allegations further contribute to the overall perception of inconsistency within the Democratic Party. And critics argue that such inconsistencies erode trust in the party's commitment to principles of justice and equal treatment under the law. When it comes to the topic of climate change, critics assert that the Democratic Party overly dramatizes the issue as a means to advance their own agenda for power and control. They argue that while Democrats present climate change as an existential threat, the scientific consensus on the matter remains far from settled. Some scientists even believe that climate change is a natural phenomenon and that human intervention may have limited impact on its progression.
This, combined with the over-dramatization on the effects of climate change inaction over the past several decades, raises questions about the extent to which the party's actions align with scientific evidence versus power and control. Another area of contention is election denial. Critics of the Democratic Party point to their reaction after the 2016 election, where there were countless claims by prominent leaders, including Hillary Clinton, Adam Schiff, Sheila Jackson Lee, Val Demings, Jennifer Wexton, Ron Wyden, Ted Lieu, Amy Klobuchar, Mark Warner, and Kamala Harris, that Dominion voting machines were suspect of hacking and voter fraud. However, when the exact same concerns were expressed during and after the 2020 election by Republicans, the Democratic Party's response took an opposite turn. The liberal media even went so far to push to defame anyone mentioning that the voting machines were fraudulent on social media, including even the current president at the time, Donald Trump, and claimed that these people were a threat to democracy. This inconsistency is evidence of the party's disregard for the rule of law and the principles they profess in regards to election integrity. So in conclusion, the increased attacks towards Christianity, perceived dishonesty, hypocrisy, and inconsistency within the Democratic Party over the past several years makes it more clear to see how the responses to different situations would raise concerns among a majority of Christians. Such attacks and discrepancies can undermine trust in the party's principles and cast doubt on their commitment to upholding moral values. This now provides the opportunity to circle back to the point made earlier about how many liberal Democrats cannot fathom how a Christian could vote for someone like Donald Trump. While Donald Trump does have a shaky history regarding his morals, and his method of attacking his opponents is rarely Christian-like, the many recent examples provided in this video should now provide a clear basis as to why many Christians would choose to vote for him. But again, it is important to remember that as Christians, we must navigate through the gray areas of politics to make sure that we choose what is most in line with our faith. Our political choices should not solely be driven on beliefs of Democrats versus Republicans, but rather those that align with God's teachings and principles to promote a net good towards society.